Well, we're in our ninth week on studying the book of Romans. And this week we're going to explore Romans 7:21 through 8 verse 27. As I prepared for this week, I'm reminded that Bible study is confusing for a lot of reasons. And one of the reasons is these chapter and verse designations. I thought maybe we could go through Romans one chapter at a time. But then you have to realize that chapter and verse designations are helpful to find content. However, it's really confusing because chapters should separate content such as paragraphs in a letter or in a manuscript. But we have to remember the chapters and verses were impositions into the text. Paul's letter was not designated by chapter and verses. It was a flowing document from beginning to end, and chapter and verses are late impositions. And so we can't hold Paul's thought according to chapter and verse. We've got to take it as a whole. And that's true with all of the books in the library that we call the Bible. Chapters and verse were added later to assist us as the reader. They weren't there to begin with. But also, I have to admit that in this weekly preparation, I'm personally almost overwhelmed with the content of Romans. Now, I've preached from it, I've studied it, I've worked with it, but this journey is a bit different for me because here I'm finding in this letter every component of the Christian faith is explored, as well as every component of my own journey of faith is addressed. And in these last couple weeks, all I can say in response to this journey that we're on together is, wow, this is about me. Now, chapter 7 concludes with Paul's description, as we dealt with last week, of the inner struggle, and it continues with those who are justified by faith. The struggle is not over. And in chapter 7, verse 24, it really sums it up well when he says, "Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death?" The law. Wretch. Recall this language? Maybe you've heard the song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word, my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be, as long as life endures. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Just right out of Paul's letter to the church at Rome. Indeed, the slave trader John Newton, who wrote this song, had a similar experience as Paul did on the road to Damascus. The slave trader's experience was on the ocean road of trading humans as slaves. Now, that's an amazing parallel to bring out for our understanding of Paul and John Newton, but it's also brings us back to the question that Paul had. Because the question that I read was, who will deliver me from the law? It's important because the main theme of the letter has to do with we recognize the gift of divine love in our lives. And we realize that we can't pull this thing off by ourselves. So the question for those who are following the law, works righteousness, is what can I do to get myself out of this dilemma? That's a good works righteousness understanding. But the question of those who are justified by faith is, who will deliver me? My dependence upon the other, my dependence upon divine love. You see, those justified by faith recognize and accept as the way out of our dilemma is the divine gift of love. Not what I can do, but what God can do for me. Chapter 8 unpacks Paul's answer to the question, who will deliver me? For he writes in chapter 8, verses 2 and 3, for the law of the Spirit of life in Christ Jesus has set me free from the law of sin and death. For God has done what the law, weakened by the flesh, could not do. Sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh for sin, he condemned sin in the flesh. God has done for me what I could not do for myself. Works righteousness for Paul, following the law, doing it himself, just didn't work. He was made right by faith, not by works. Now, it's fascinating the language that Paul uses, and we could have whole Sundays just dealing with a word here and there in terms of the way Paul uses language. But in verses 8 to 10 in chapter 8, there's the interchangeable use of some phrases. He uses the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ, and Christ interchangeably in meaning. Again, uses Spirit of God sometimes, Spirit of Christ other times, and then just Christ. You see, this reveals Paul's belief and understanding of the revelation of divine love in the Christ event. Paul believed Jesus' self-understanding when he said, I and the Father are one. The Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God. Christ, used interchangeably, focuses on, indeed, the Christ event. For in chapter 8, verse 15, for you did not receive the spirit of slavery to fall back into fear, but you have received the spirit of sonship when we cry, Abba, Father. And you see, in this phrase of Abba, Father, that has become part of the tradition of the liturgy of the church, describes that family relationship that is involved in being justified by faith. For indeed, that family relationship of God, that we experience God as a son would experience a father, as a daughter would experience a mother, that family relationship extended to all human beings, to all of God's children, because all are adopted by divine love. Indeed, this Spirit of God, this Spirit of Christ, the Christ event, is what sustains those who are justified by faith. There is no sustaining element in living by the law. It's all up to the efforts of a believer, which we fall short if we believe in justification by works. Paul, in the spirit of the campfire stories of old, remember the rainbow? And in the courageous hope yet to be written by John of Patmos to the Christians under persecution, as he wrote in the book of Revelation, Paul relies on the divine gift of love to sustain him in his journey of being justified by faith. The sustentation, the sustaining element that keeps us going in faith is the Christ event, revealing that divine love is a gift to be recognized by the believer. Last week I had an interesting conversation of a person who's not a part of our church goal experience. It was separate from that. This person doesn't even know I'm doing this with you folks. This person had a terrible tragedy happen in their life, the kind of tragedy that turned many persons into bitterness, many persons really turning their back on what was meaningful to them before the experience took place. And after this experience took place, she just somehow kept on keeping on. And persons would say to her, "How can you keep on keeping on after such a terrible thing happened to you? You know, how can you stay with your faith when it didn't work for you? You were not rewarded. Why don't you feel abandoned by that which you once believed in?" This person said to me, I didn't have good answers then, but looking back on it, I now know that the reason I was sustained was because I knew I wasn't alone. Divine love, the Spirit of Christ, the Spirit of God, the Christ event never left me alone. See, that is what sustains us. Not our own will, not our own wants, not our own liturgy, but the Christ event. And this is what Paul captures when he describes how those justified by faith are sustained by the gift given to them, not by their own works. It's an incredible piece of proclamation right at the center of the book that we call Romans. Now for some things we might think about. First of all, righteousness is for Paul the consequence of living according to the law. What matters is what is legal, not what is morally right. Now, Paul's righteousness was expressed in the persecution and judgment of the early Christian movement. The righteousness of the hymn writer was the persecution of slaves. What are common contemporary acts of wretchedness, persecution? Secondly, because of our own cultural norm and commitment to individual rights and power, are we so committed to solving human dilemmas by our own efforts, justification by works, that we cannot accept the gift of divine love, justification by faith? Finally, what are our own personal experiences of being sustained by hope, the Spirit of Christ, even against our own will and desire? That's enough to think about. We'll talk about it on Sunday.